Hello, all. It's Friday morning. We are post-Trump victory, and I think we got a lot to hear from the one and only Joti Brar. Let's talk. Good morning, all. We are here with the one and only Joti Brar, and she's going to give us the inside scoop, the skinny, as they say, on the dynamics, the political dynamics throughout the U.S. empire, throughout the imperialist world. And just as a very brief setup, yesterday I had Scott Ritter on, a dear friend, a guy that I think the world of. And Scott, as a lot of Americans, was very, what's the word? I guess he saw a potential for some good things that could happen as a result of Trump. And we had this great talk. And here's what I say. In the universe where all things are possible, those potentials exist, right? The Trump wave could collapse. And then there we go. We could have wonderful things. But I am quite skeptical. And I'm more aligned with the belief that things are similar to the UK, wherein people do the old seesaw. We want Labor. Oh, we're unhappy with them. Let's go to Tories. Darn, we're getting the same thing. Let's go back to Labor. Oh, rats, we're getting the same thing. And at some point, people get to the end of their rope where they realize that maybe that's where revolution. Are we in a pre-revolutionary period? Are we in a preemptive counter-revolution? Oh, this is going to be fun. Joti Brar, what the hell is going on here?
Garland, one thing I really noticed with all the discussion about elections these days is the hidden numbers. They're very, very good at focusing us on percentages of votes. So out of all the people voted, this many people did this, Hispanics did this, but so it's like all white women did this, all Hispanics did this, right? But it's like, okay, so, a certain proportion of black men who voted this way. But how many black men voted? Now, I don't have access to all the numbers that I need to give you a brilliant breakdown, but the numbers that I could get hold of indicated to me that of the adults that's over 18s who live in the USA, less than 55% voted altogether. Mm-hmm. So what the flip does that tell you about the great American democracy and how people are feeling about this seesaw, as you say, the eternal back and forth seesaw? We saw very much the same thing in Britain. I talked to you about this before, but in Britain, it's even more stark. The numbers of people who don't vote at all, and the way our system is set up, like yours, it's set up in a weird, very manipulable way so that the popular vote and the actual outcome are two separate things. Many people don't bother voting because they know they can't influence the result, for a start. A lot of other people don't vote because they've realized whichever way it goes, it makes no difference to their life. The same people are in power, enacting the same policies, right? Lots of people have worked that out, and they're totally cynical about politics and politicians and elections. I found that out years ago when I was trying to campaign for the Workers' Party, knocking on doors in working class areas and saying to people, they would agree with every single thing that I said about what was wrong with society and how we need to change things. But it was really clear talking to them that they were not going to go out and vote because they'd given up on the voting system and they knew it didn't impact their life. And to be honest with you, I agreed with them. I didn't particularly enjoy standing on the doorstep saying, no, but vote for us because, we'll run this borough better than Labour did. We hate Labour too. It's not much of a message, is it? Really for me, the interesting thing about that experience was listening to people and seeing where they were at. And what I saw was people weren't apathetic. They were angry. They were supremely cynical. But their cynicism didn't just extend to the ruling elite and the politicians who served them. It also extended to themselves. And we'll come to this in a minute, but what they didn't have was any sense of themselves as a class, as an organizable force that could wield power in the land if it was actually harnessed. You know, they had come to believe the propaganda that they're just weak individuals who can't do anything. So they detach from what's happening, but their anger doesn't go away. And in fact, it's growing for all the reasons we know. Essentially because the cost of living crisis, the inflation crisis, the unemployment crisis, the deindustrialization crisis, you know, all these things are piling on top of one another. People's lives are getting worse by the day. And what they see is that the politicians have no interest and no ability to change any of that. And of course, you know, the fact that endless money is found, usually printed, to fuel these wars abroad, while everything is left to rot, infrastructure, services, industries at home, of course that is massively galling to people. But I do think we have to recognize that all of the hype about percentages of votes and swings this way and that way really hide this underlying story of a steady alienation and disenfranchisement of masses of poor working class people. And it's the poorest sections of the working class who have stopped voting entirely, who are not watching this news, who are not pinning all their hopes on Donald Trump, right? Yes, I absolutely understand that this whole MAGA nonsense, I'm sorry, it's nonsense, has been fueled by a wish on behalf of people who do still believe that voting will get you somewhere, that something can be changed with their vote. And Donald Trump's done a good job, or his people, of presenting him as the thing that can fix things. And a lot of people are investing Donald Trump with a lot of abilities that he simply doesn't have. They're investing his team, they're investing his office with abilities it doesn't have. And I think people's memories are very short. And even you see a kind of cognitive dissonance amongst those people who still believe that somewhere at the bottom of the American Constitution is a democracy which is popular. And this is a thing that people don't really understand, and why I ask everybody who's still believing in that to go and read Lenin's State and Revolution and Lenin's Imperialism, so you understand what is this system that we live under, and how does the state work? How does the ruling class maintain its hold on the people? Because these institutions, these elected offices, they are not where decision-making power lies. And we saw that with Trump's first administration. Anyone can say anything they like about everything he learned since the first time. What I think he learned was how to come to terms with his real bosses. And, you know, they'll let him bluster around in return for, you know, a lot of money. But if you actually look at what happened, the times when he was trying to front up for, you know, some of his common sense policies, like, oh, well, all this war in the Middle East is a bit silly, we're going to pull the troops out of Syria. I'm pretty sure that commander-in-chief, so say, gave a direct order for the pulling out of the troops from Syria. Did he not? Correct me.
Yeah, apparently he wrote, yes, he said do it. And Iraq and Syria, and they just didn't do it.
Troops out, and nothing happened.
Right.
Because it turns out the commander-in-chief is not the commander-in-chief, right? And like, how many times do we have to be taught this lesson before we learn it? You know, we are subject to this, not just we're brought up with all this propaganda that prettifies and deifies all our institutions and makes them sound like they came from God and they are the embodiment of freedom and justice. But like we want it to be true. And the reason we want it to be true, Garland, is because for so long as the system delivers anything to us, so long as we are even the slightest bit comfortable still in our lives, we don't want to face up to the reality, which is what you said in the opening. We need a revolution. Now, it was very interesting to me listening to Scott on your show yesterday. I found it really hard, actually, to listen to his list of wishes of what Donald Trump could potentially mean, and that this is a MAGA. What I really heard was he knows we need a revolution. He wants it to be true that the revolution can happen with votes. I'm afraid he's going to be severely disappointed. And all the people like him, of whom there are many, good people, sincere people, who believe the mythology about American democracy being a popular, for the masses, for the people, by the people, for the people, all that stuff they tell you. The people referred to in the US Constitution are the capitalists. That should have become clear to everybody quite a long time ago. Okay, but it hasn't been rammed home to them, mainly because in your country, like in my country, like in all the rest of the West, the communist movement was co-opted, bought off, and died after World War II. And we have to start again. We have to rebuild it. There's no way around it. Doesn't matter how internalized all of our anti-communism is. Doesn't matter how much we wish we could do it with voting. Doesn't matter how much we don't want it to be true. It is true. That's why I go around like an early Christian preacher saying, study Marxism. Like they used to say, read the Bible, read the gospel, whatever. You know, sometimes I can feel like the most repetitive stuck record on the planet. But this is the message the workers need, Garland, which is why I'm very grateful to you for giving me this time every week to tell people the same thing over and over again. Maybe one day the message will start to sink in. Occasionally it does. There is no way around this, people. You know, we must understand the system under which we live so that we can understand how we get out of the contradictions in which this system has landed us. Right? None of this is about the people in charge. It's about the way the system operates through its own laws, which are built into this system of production. The system of capitalist production for profit creates all these problems. Now the system is a global system. It creates these systems on a global scale. These economic crises in which we are now plunged. Right? This is the driving force for the war. It's the driving force for austerity and unemployment and inflation. It's the driving force for the misery of the masses. It's the driving force, therefore, for repression and anti-people measures. It's the driving force for the war and more and more and more war, for destruction of life on a humongous scale. All of that is required to keep capitalism going on a global scale. We have to choose. Are you prepared to live as someone who becomes ever more impoverished, is sent, or your children are sent as cannon fodder, so that all the wealth you've produced can be destroyed to re-kickstart the economy? Or are you going to organize into a mass working class party that is capable of leading a revolutionary movement to get rid of this system and put the working class in charge of production? Those are our options. There are the third way that's been dangled in front of us ever since World War II, and especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, was a mirage. It was a lie. It was a way of buying us off, pacifying us, misdirecting our anger and confusion. And you know, it's time to wake up. All of these dreams have been exposed, and it's sad to me to see how much it takes for people to wake up to this reality. But I'm afraid reality is going to keep forcing itself on people's attention, no matter how hard they try to hide from it.
RAI, as they say, reality asserts itself. I'm sure everyone's heard that before. You know, what's interesting is this. That's, again, it's a little bit of a conversation, and that is they have effectively redefined the term left, right, in the US, because this is what happens. Now it's, and I hear these people, yes, the left, because all they talk about is the trans stuff. The everyone's a racist, a sexist, misogynist. So what they've done is, I always, when people say, well, and I say I'm lefty, they say, what do you mean by the left? I say, I view lens through the politics of economic class. Simple as that. That's the foundation of my view of politics. I don't care what you call it. It's through the lens of economic class. I've been around rich people enough to know that they view, first and foremost, politics through the lens of economic class, but they don't want the working class and the poor people to do. You get around a bunch of stinking rich people, there's no Democrats and Republicans and left and right. Their concept of politics is viewed in their economic interest, right? Here in America, even now that it's over, you listen to the the neoliberal news, right? Well, as you said, the black males between the ages of 18 and 29 who wear short hair and have a mustache and wear blue on a Tuesday voted this way. But the ones that are above 6 foot, they break it down into these absurd, esoteric categories that mean nothing so they can pretend to have a discussion. But ultimately, when people say, well, why did black voters or the voters that voted abandon the Democratic Party? I say, because the price of stuff is too high. It is material. They want us to have a discussion that's non-material. They want to define the left through sexism, racism, all this crap that's not material. And ultimately, what people vote on, I always believe this, they got families to feed. That's the long and short of it. Your thoughts on the discussion that they've effectively redefined the left through the lens of non-material LGBT, as if the ruling elite are looking out for the little guy. They're standing up for the LGBT community, for women, for minorities, for that. At any rate, your thoughts on the redefinition of the left and the fact that politics comes down, or my opinion, that politics comes down to economic class and material survival.
100%. This whole turning of the left and the right away from, as you said, used to be understood in terms of class affiliation. And now it's a culture wars terminology. And the brilliance of this from the ruling class perspective is they've essentially reshaped their narrative of politics to be one which encourages us to identify with one side or the other like a football team and give it our loyalty. But what that means is the working class is divided along these culture wars lines, and it affiliates itself to what? To a section of the ruling class. And it looks to that section of the ruling class to protect it against the other team. And it looks to the state to protect it, the ruling class's state, to protect it against what it thinks the other team might do in power or with laws or whatever. So it actually reinforces the people's belief in, faith in, hope in a section of the ruling class, B, a section, the power, the benign possibilities of the state machine, the laws and the judiciary and the system of education and all of that, which is controlled by the ruling class in its interests. It encourages us to believe and put our faith in these things acting in our interests, because we're focused on the other team and beating them and stopping them. And they're the threat to our existence, not capitalism, which is impoverishing us and destroying our industrial capacity, destroying our livelihoods, destroying our neighborhoods. No, that's not our enemy. Our enemy is the workers in the other team, and they have to be crushed. And we're going to align with a section of the ruling class to do it. Now, it's a new way of wrapping up identity politics, actually. Identity politics does the same thing. It took the women's question. Fundamentally, women's oppression comes with class society, and it will go when class society goes. That makes the women's question, the question for women's liberation, a class question. It means it's related to the revolution. It means that women who want true liberation, true equality, need to be fighting for socialism. They need to tie themselves to the socialist revolution. Identity politics says, women, your enemy is not the system, your enemy is men. And you must all get together against the men, no matter what your class. So your husbands, your brothers, your fathers, your sons are now your enemy. There was a genuine lesbian, I've said it upside down. I've done a spoiler. A genuine feminist slogan in the 70s, I think the 70s, which was kick the enemy out of your bed. They were encouraging, and this was a time when the women's movement was a mass working class movement. They were saying the answer is to become an ideological lesbian. I mean, the fact of what that does for society, if we all refuse any longer to have children, nobody thinks any of this through, do they? This was a genuine slogan that came out of the women's movement from, of course, bourgeois elements. Kick the enemy out of your bed, stop sleeping with the enemy because your enemy is men, right? So this is a way of subverting the movement and stopping working class women engaging with it. Of course, they mostly went home after that kind of thing was going on. Burning your bra and blaming your husband is not the answer to women's oppression, right? And it was clear to them that this wasn't addressing their issues of having all the extra work to do on top of their jobs, of not getting the same pay as men for the same work, of having second-class citizens, status legally, all kinds of things. They wanted, real things addressed. And they weren't going to be addressed by these people who were posing around and making stupid, radical sounding, but obviously stupid sloganeering. So they went away, and the women's movement became a kind of academic movement that moved into academia and resulted in the world of identity politics we have today. Same thing happened with the anti-racist movement. It basically got dominated, taken over by Black nationalists. The anti-racist movement, again, it's totally connected to the anti-imperialist movement. Imperialism, capitalism needs racism, cannot do without it, because it justifies the way it treats the colonies. The racism, it justifies the way it treats those immigrants when they come to our country and divides the working class against itself. Very, very important. We should never forget that the prototype of all of this for the British, and they were the first, let's also not forget, was Ireland. So racism isn't even to do with colour of skin. The Irish are basically the same people as the British genetically and all of that stuff. I'm sure some people will argue with me, but it's basically...
And the Russians. Russians. I mean, they hate the Russians are like honorary Black people in Europe. You know what I mean? They look, they don't like them. They're inferior as human beings. And interestingly enough, they got all these wonderful resources, just like the Africans that the capitalists want to go steal. They are really the Black people of Europe from that perspective. From a colonial perspective, it's the same thing. The Russians are stupid and they're violent and they're inferior, and they just happen to have all of these wonderful natural resources.
They can't be trusted to run their own country or take care of their own resources. They need us to come and civilize them. Right. So, but this methodology of justifying wars and exploitation abroad and dividing the population at home is built into imperialism. It's absolutely its bread and butter. It needs it to survive and justify itself. And the specific target of the day shifts. So we've had Irish, we've had Blacks. At the moment, it's mostly Islamophobia, with, of course, some Russophobia and Sinophobia thrown in. But Islamophobia has been the main one for the last kind of 20 years. And you see why when you see what's the target of imperialist aggression right now. And, then it feeds into the anti-immigrant narrative at home, which is really super important for dividing the working class against itself and stopping it being active. So this is the function of identity politics that you were talking about. And this is really what they've done with politics generally. They've turned every type of politics into a kind of identity politics where you're asked to identify with a section of the ruling class, to put your faith in the system to solve your problems, to ask the state to suppress another section of the working class in the hope that somehow by doing that, your life is going to get better. Newsflash, it isn't.
So, let's broaden this out, because it is the same dynamic. If we look at what's happening in Germany, right? The Scholz coalition going down. The right now in Japan, LDP, the new guy comes in and we're going to make change. He decides he's going to have a snap election, doesn't go. That's interesting too. You see these people come in and they decide they're going to have a snap election, whether it's the Brits, whether it's France. Now it is Japan. They're so blind, they think we're going to have a snap election, and then our section of the ruling elite are really going to take everything, and they have the snap election, and they're like, hey, the people, the unwashed, the hoi polloi didn't vote the way Brexit. The hoi polloi, the unwashed masses, they didn't vote the way we wanted them to vote. Darn them. And then they're angry at them, of course. Your thoughts on that this dynamic, Germany, UK, and of course Japan, which I don't know as well, but this stuff's falling apart.
This again, Garland, highlights this crisis of legitimacy, which is growing all the way across all the imperialist countries, precisely because of the economic crisis. So we have this global overproduction crisis of capitalism. What does it mean? It means that there are fewer jobs, and the jobs there are less well-paying and less useful than there used to be in all the imperialist countries. At the same time as that, there are massive cuts and a steady and now accelerating deterioration in services, health, education, community facilities, in infrastructure maintenance, because all our imperialists now are basically financiers, and they all make their money through export of capital and repatriation of profits from abroad. And what that means is not only they've kind of mothballed most of the industry that used to be the mainstay of their economies back when they were developing their industrial power, but they don't really care about the infrastructure either. When it mattered for their profits that the infrastructure was slick and efficient, all our cities in Britain are full of Georgian and Victorian kind of monuments to capitalism, big, beautiful buildings, all our best infrastructure, our beautiful railway stations, all constructed during this time of industrial expansion of our ruling class. But now that they do all their industry elsewhere, all of it is falling apart and going to ruin. Our roads are full of potholes, our trains don't work, everything, bridges are falling down, all this stuff that we think of as, we don't even pick up the litter anymore. All the stuff that we think of as a sign of a kind of third world, undeveloped, backward economy is now how our country looks. Our children go to school, but they don't get educated there. It's like a holding pen. We have officially a health service, but it can take you a month to see a GP face to face if you're lucky. And, when that happens, it doesn't mean you're going to then get referred on to whatever specialist you need. It's, the whole thing is falling apart at the seams. And this is the reality of people's lives. So they're angry. They thought the world that they'd won after World War II, the peace deal that was done that brought them the welfare state and all those social advantages, they thought that was permanent. Again, we see the failure of the communist movement to explain to people that until we have socialism, nothing is permanent. Everything the ruling class gives, it takes back or distorts or pollutes or turns against you in some way. There is no way for permanent security to exist under capitalist conditions. There's only going forwards to socialism that can bring that by abolishing the profit motive, abolishing this drain of wealth from the poor to the rich, and this machine that creates crisis. So we have this situation, economic crisis is driving austerity. It's driving export of capital even more. It's driving the world into war, and more war. And of course, as we said earlier, the dissonance, the cognitive dissonance between we can't find, £100,000 to fix your kid's school or a couple of million to deliver a proper postal service or, fix the roads near you. But we are going to find 20 billion a year to send to Ukraine because this war is really, really important. We're standing with Ukraine. There's a massive cognitive dissonance between those types of messages for people. And so, of course, during this time, this is when the increasing alienation between the people and the political system, the people and the political parties that they thought represented them. And it used to be in these social democratic countries, in the post-war imperialist world, the mass of workers, especially industrial workers, basically believed that their party was the Labour Party or whatever the equivalent is in your country. Over the last 4 decades, they've seen that isn't true. So many of them, as we said earlier, they stop voting because they can see it doesn't change their life. This party doesn't represent me. I've been voting for them, and my dad did, and my granddad did, all of our lives. And in the last 4 decades, when things were going wrong for us, they didn't do a thing for us. So they give up on that. So there's a crisis of legitimacy. And the problem is that increasingly, governments expose themselves very, very quickly after they're brought in. So there's still, for the people who are still voting, they're voting in the hope that voting changes things. But they very quickly see, they get a new government and they find things are continuing on the same path, and the promises they make, they immediately find a reason not to enact. I mean, Keir Starmer's government did a blinder, that the press all obediently, stenographed as they do, repeated out to us. The second they got into office, they said, oh, we've been looking at the books and we've found there's what did I say, 20 billion black hole. Unfortunately, what this means is we're ripping up all our election promises. It was amazing. Like, they did it week 1. And that was, of course, they did that after the very first speech, I think, that Starmer made after he was elected in July was, our commitment to Ukraine is unshakable. Our commitment to NATO is unshakable. This is our priority. That's the first thing he told us. The next thing he told us was, oh, there's a 20 billion black hole. The next thing he told us was, there's some hard decisions coming. And then he started attacking the working class and the most vulnerable sections, the benefit, refusing to lift a benefit cap that when he was in opposition, he had said was inhuman because it basically penalizes the poorest poor children in the working class, right? That means testing the winter fuel allowance that keeps old people alive, to make sure that they can heat and eat when it's cold, right? All these types of things. These are the things that he's looking to save money on, not Ukraine, which he will keep printing as much money as he's told to for, and never mind the inflation, side effect that is going to attack every single worker in the country, right? So this political crisis is a result of the economic crisis. And then they kind of fuel one another. The economic crisis fuels this political crisis. The political crisis is fueling the instability. It's a symptom of the instability, and it fuels the instability. And it's like a steadily increasing pace at which people are losing faith, not just in this or that politician, but in the whole system, as you were saying earlier.
Yeah, I think that in looking at what's going on here, people are looking for that, like, okay, Trump's going to do all these things. Here, let me give you a perfect example. Elon Musk is the richest man in the world, right? His buddy, his comrade, right? His ace. And he says, yes, I'm going to put him in charge of efficiency to go in the main government and cut and make things work. And so here's what I hear. So I had someone, it might have been Dr. Richard Wolff or someone, another guy, Dr. Jack Rasmus. He wrote a book called The Scourge of Neoliberalism. And he came up with about, since 2016, $1 trillion in tax cuts and other things that they've just given to the top 1%, right? And he said, it talked about that. So 16 trillion goes to the wealthy, the corporate oligarchs, etc. So now here's what I interpret. And Musk said there's going to be some pain. The working class got to take a haircut. He's going to come in and he's going to look through and say, we've been overspending, which we haven't been spending. We've been handing money to you. We've spent too much. Who'd it go to? No discussion of that. Now, in a more general sense, we've got to cut. It's just absurd what these people have been doing. They've been spending money like crazy. Well, gee, could we cut the Pentagon budget? How about those tax cuts that go to you? We got to go into the government. And now, basically, as my point was, the austerity monsters are here. And now it's time to pay for the things that we've been spending money on, which is war. And I think basically when Dr. Jack got finished, he showed somewhere around $15 trillion in this war crap and of 16 trillion given away. We're $38 trillion in debt, and he got up to the mid 30s in just wasted money given to the rich in a war. All of our debt, all of it. You know what it reminds me of? What you just said. We got a $20 billion hole. Okay, economic hole. Yeah. We're giving $20 billion to Ukraine. Well, I'm no mathematician, but I can figure out you just found the money to deal with that $20 billion hole, and you gave it to the friggin' Nazis. Well, not the Nazis, actually. Their job is to die. You gave it to the people who are, and anyway, your thoughts on that? This concept of they give all the money to the rich, and then now the working class have to take a haircut. And Trump's kind of telling us what's going to happen.
You know, you put your finger on it just there at the end, Garland, that you know, the narrative is we gave the money to Ukraine. The truth is they gave it to themselves. It's their war for their profits. That's why they're spending it. It's an investment for them. But also, in the course of waging this war to ensure future profits and domination of Ukraine and Russia, they are giving themselves money. How is that money 20 billion? Okay, where does it go? Mainly, it goes to military industrial complex companies, arms providers. So they just printed a load of money that devalued your currency to give to people who are going to pay themselves essentially to make profits. We subsidize the profits of the arms companies. That's what we did. And then if it goes to Ukraine, well, who is Volodymyr Zelensky? He's a puppet. He's an actor. Yes, he gets a cut. I hear people making jokes about, you know, he gets a cut of everything, 10% for the big guy. Okay, he's got a commission for, you know, that's how he gets paid for that, for fronting up for the imperialists and making Ukraine for narrative and Hollywood purposes, making Ukraine look like a independent and sovereign country, which of course it has been for a very long time. That's his job. That's what he's getting paid for. So he takes a cut. He buys his villas around the world. Good luck with ever being able to retire to one of those, Vladimir. I am not convinced you'll ever get to do that. But you know, he lives in hope also that one day he's going to be allowed to retire to one of his villas. But the rest of that money goes to Vladimir's handlers, who are British, American, or Ukrainian oligarchs, right? Who are all in it together, right? So this idea that the money goes to Ukraine is absolutely nonsensical. Ukraine is being pillaged. Ah, yes, there we go. Right. These are the ways that the people in charge get their payout. They've got various ways of getting paid, don't they? You know, and getting close to the place where all the money gets spent has become one of the favored ways to get paid. You know, it's really, for me, the big difference between Donald Trump and, say, the Clinton, Obama, and Biden types is that Clinton, Obama, and Biden needed to get into those positions of power to get their noses close to the trough and get paid. And their job was to front for the system in return for massive backhanders. Trump's kind of interesting in that he's already in the capitalist class. He's a member of that class. He's a junior member compared to the big monopolists. And some of his griping at the big companies comes from his sense as a big businessman that the playing field is not level. He doesn't have the kind of trillions at his disposal that would enable him to be a real decision maker in the country, and it irks him. You know, having however many millions he has is not enough to make you a decision maker anymore. It's not enough to make you a member of the big capitalist class anymore, because you have to be commanding trillions, you know, to be one of those people now. Just very briefly, it's a bit of a side thing, but this richest man in the world thing, I do have a bit of a caveat to that.
Right.
I don't think we know who the richest people in the world are, because since the Second World War, they've been doing a very good job. The real rich, who inherit their money. In fact, they don't make it even from, you know, small to big capital. These days, none of them are making it that way. The real super big rich have created a whole network of layers and layers of anonymity, shell companies and offshores and tax havens, and, you know, this web of, and then of course they have the most highly paid, you know, wealth management teams and accountants to enable them to stay anonymous, and for us not to know the size of their holdings and their riches. So the people who have to declare their wealth are the people who don't come from that class, have come up, you know, so they're the kind of self-made, as they call it, millionaires and billionaires who've come from small capital to big capital in one generation. They're the ones who have to declare a certain amount of their wealth, and that gets measured, and then we have our rich lists, and we all look over there at the people we've heard of, you know. But I'm pretty sure, Garland, that there's a layer of the super rich who you don't know their names, and you don't know how much they're holding, and that's not a conspiracy. It's just, you know, they've set the system up that way. They don't want to be known and talked about and in the newspapers and all the rest of it, and they don't want us to know how rich they are or how powerful they are, you know. And they have, you know, ways of influencing, you know, how things work, which is, you know, buy everything, and they're the ones who fund all these think tanks and such, you know, so that and it's the think tanks that draft the laws and shape the policies and buy the senators, and, you know, all these people that we look at. The circus of politics is like such a machine of distraction, and you have this idea that you can lobby your senator, you know, and anyone can lobby the senator, so that's fair, isn't it? Turns out not really. There was a few years ago they did that investigation, didn't they, into American politics, and this was some, you know, research institute, might have even been the Pew Institute, and they came up with the conclusion that, oh, America's an oligarchy. It turns out there's a very small number of people who genuinely get to influence policy, and those are people who have so much wealth that they just buy everything they need to buy to shape everything up. So, and I think the other thing we have to recognize, now you'll have to tell me if I forgot to answer your question, because I got told off last week. You asked me a question and I went,
no.
That's, I didn't answer it.
No, that's just Kamala Harris stuff of not answering questions. You're usually pretty good.
Just coming back on that again, there's a comment I wanted to remind people of. I'm sure many of your viewers will have seen it, but before the election, Larry Fink, now, he is the director of the biggest hedge fund on the planet, in command of trillions and trillions of global wealth, right? And he said to the Financial Times, I'm a bit tired of seeing all these stories about how this is the most important election. He said, they say that about every election. He said, the reality is it makes no difference. As far as we are concerned, both sides work for us. And the agenda, the results out the other side are going to be what we want. It doesn't matter who wins. Very frank and very honest reflection of reality. For the ruling class, they own both parties, including Donald Trump. And that's the one, yes. Who carried out that study?
Let's go to Princeton University, Professor Martin Gillens, So it's
Princeton.
Yeah. Let me go to the study if it'll let me. Testing theories of American politics, elites, interest groups, and average citizens. Published online by Cambridge University Press. There you go. So, but basically the study, as I'm sure you're familiar with it, basically what they did was quite simple. They looked at things such as 95% of the people want this, but they can't get it. 1% of the people who are rich want this, and they can get it, and that happens every time. That only can lead you to one conclusion. It's the 1% that are in charge. And one of the things that I brought up, well, to align with that, is the Democratic Party. 88% of Democrats want a national health service, Medicare for all, everybody's covered, but they can't get it. And my thing is already said, well, that makes it obvious that it's the 12% that runs the party. And that's just to me an example of, they'll tell us racism, sexism, homophobia, blah, blah, blah. But when it comes to health service, that is important. That is critical to survival.
And Garland, the truth is 99% of the people want it, because that 11 out of those 12% have just been hoodwinked by a bunch of stupid propaganda into believing that somehow something bad will come from paying for healthcare for everybody. You know, they've been tricked and lied to. If they genuinely lived in a society that delivered decent free healthcare to everybody, they would not want to get rid of that.
You got to add one other thing. So there was this same study said 88% of Democrats want it. 52% of Republicans want it. There's one problem with that study. 43% of Americans now are neither Democrats nor Republicans. So they always leave out that, other 43% who had it up to here and walked away with those two parties because they have no trust. We have to pretend like the only dynamic is Democrats versus Republicans.
Exactly what we were talking about earlier.
It used to be 30% and 30% were the two parties, and now it's bleeding down. 43%, far more than either party, as you were saying at the beginning of this, have thrown in the towel on this whole system.
And they're not in the narrative, Garland. They're not in the narrative, are they?
No.
All those people. And that whole section of society that has detached itself from this team sport game is ignored. And that's why the way that the narrative is presented to you is so important, to look beyond that. This, like we were talking at the beginning, this percentage swings this way and that way, and the way that these percentages are talked about as if it's of American people, when it's not at all. It's of those people who voted, this many
likely
black
voters.
men. It's not all black men.
Yeah, I think they refer to, when they do these polls, they'll say likely voters, X percentage of likely voters, but they never do any polls that are regarding the unlikely voters. They never do a poll that or a study that says, let's talk to the unlikely voters and see what they have to say about this or that. They don't want us to know that they exist.
They don't. They don't. They want the people who don't vote to feel like they're the only one when they're sat at home.
Wow. So let me ask you this. Well, let me throw this at you. One of the things I think that's going on here is, and this is about imperialism with Trump, as to why maybe even a large faction of the ruling elite may be like supportive and glad that Trump is in power, right? There's clearly a faction in the ruling elite that's pro-Trump, right? Or he wouldn't be there. He'd be dead. And certainly it seems to me that there's a faction of the ruling elite that may have already attempted to address matters in that particular way. I think there are people looking at Ukraine, whatever, China, whatever, and they're saying, look, the oil is in the Middle East. We got to prioritize things here. And it's looking like we're going to lose that. Screw Ukraine. Let that go. China, all these other, and let all this stuff go. The Zionist project, if we lose that, and we lose the oil and gas and the energy in the Middle East, we are screwed. And I think what you're going to see with Trump is there, because Trump's like, Ukraine, who cares about that? And certain people are like, yes, that shows that he's anti-war or he's opposed, blah, blah, blah. When possibly it's going to be more like Trump saying, no, no, no. And this faction says, we got to get a grip back on the Middle East because we got to find a way. And I think there's a realism there that'll even say, it looks like Israel's lost. They may have lost. So how can we massage this thing so that even though Israel's lost physically their conflict about kind of a revolutionary minded resistance in the Middle East that says we ain't putting up with the capitalists coming here, taking all of our crap, including our land. I think they're looking at how can we come out of this thing and still have the influence we need to have. I think, and they want to put Trump in there so they can still come out of that, which is going to have to mean suppressing Iran's power some kind of way, maybe not through war. Maybe they're like, if we go to war here, we lose. Maybe, what do you think about that? A refocus on this area, the argument among factions of the ruling elite over, no, we got to refocus here because screw all the rest of the stuff. We can't lose this. Anyway.
It's really interesting, Garland, and I think you put your finger on something very important, that there are factions within the ruling class, and they do argue with one another, and they do have divisions over, and the divisions get deeper the deeper the crisis gets, because it's an existential threat to them. How do we survive this crisis? And different factions think different things and argue about it. So I think it's perfectly possible that the arrival of Donald Trump as president could be used as a cover story for essentially cutting the funding to Ukraine and leaving it to its own devices. Well, I should think what they'll try to do is leave it to Europe to keep it going. I think they would like it to keep going as long as possible if they can possibly find a way to do it. But I think that there's definitely a serious faction amongst the US ruling class that has always felt like Russia was the wrong focus. Actually, China used to be the main focus of those people. Now, those who prioritized and pushed for war with Russia also want to bring down China too. But their belief was Russia will be easier, and bringing down Russia will stop China having anyone to support it when they then turn to China. So there's this, this hope that they can keep Russia and China separate and take them down one by one. Now, of course, the Russians and Chinese don't live in a vacuum. They're perfectly aware of this. And in fact, the course of the war against Russia has made the Russia and China alliance stronger than ever. And in fact, President Putin at Valdai this week said Russia-China relationship is the best it's ever been in our entire history. Now, I would beg to differ. I think there were a few years after the revolution, before the death of Stalin, when they were really the best they'd ever been between the whole of the peoples. But, since that time, for sure, Russian and Chinese cooperation and friendship and strategic partnership has reached a whole new level that, in 1990 would have seemed almost impossible.
I'll just throw this in there. Yeah. I think him saying that was not necessarily really saying it's the best it's ever been. I think it was a rhetorical comment for a reason. You know what I mean? Yeah, it was a statement to, exactly, a message to the world.
Totally.
Not that, okay, we could look at this period, or we could look at 564 years ago. I think it was, here's the message, everybody.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
We've understood. We know what your game is. We know what your game is, and you have lost. You have lost that game.
Yes.
Because we are here for one another in an unbreakable bond. We are not going to let you take us apart and destroy us one by one, right? So that was
it was an answer to Trump. Trump recently said, I'm going to come back and I'm going to separate Russia and China. I think Putin was answering him. I think that was really an answer to Trump.
Yeah. And the fact is, they messed it up entirely. In the Cold War period, the imperialists did a very good job of getting in the cracks between Russia and China and widening them to the maximum level and turning them against one another. They massively benefited from that disaster that befell the working class. This was a real defeat for the masses of the world and a victory for the imperialists to be able to do that. They have lost that advantage. Their strategy has completely boomeranged in their faces. The Chinese and Russians and people all over the world have learned some important lessons from the defeats we've suffered. That's the thing about defeat. It's not the end. It's something that teaches you in the harshest possible way something about your enemy, and then you get up, sort yourself out, and come back. The problem with the imperialists is they never recognize that the other side can learn and develop and come back. So that definitely has been happening. I think that, as a face-saving device, if the dominant section of the US ruling class decides, and it's still an if, I'm definitely not making a prediction this will happen, if they've decided that they've got to cut and run from Ukraine and hand it over to the Europeans to try and keep going as best they can, then Donald Trump being elected is the perfect cover story. because again, it keeps this myth going that it's up to the president what happens, which is very important for public consumption, right? All around the world, other states who've dealt with US presidents have started to say, you know, it doesn't matter what this president or that president says. You've got to deal with the regime and recognize that the regime isn't trustworthy, and doesn't matter what this or that president will agree to. North Koreans said it only recently. You know, we will no longer negotiate with presidents. If the regime, you know, wants to talk to us on a kind of state level, you know, we'll think about it. But there's no point conducting negotiations with an individual. Doesn't matter what high status he has, high level office he has. He's not the person in charge, and we've worked that out. So there's no point, you know, repeating. So there's not going to be, you know, for all the wishes that come out of people, this idea that Trump can come back and bring back the peace talks with North Korea, that's done. They destroyed that, and I don't think that's going to happen. But so there's a possibility for the ruling class to use the election of Donald Trump to concoct a face-saving narrative as it backpedals its way out of standing with Ukraine for as long as it takes, forever and ever, until victory and the balkanization of Russia and the regime change and the destruction of Vladimir Putin and his evil regime, right? They got to find some way back. So they can construct, you know, the Democrats and Hollywood can construct a narrative that said, oh, we were just about to make our final push to victory, and then Trump came in and ruined it. And they don't have to admit they've been defeated, Garland.
Yeah, I was about to say, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. When they're about to get knocked out, instead, just before the final punch, they go, you know what? We're tired of this fight anyway. You know, we got other things to do. It's getting late. I got to go home and have dinner. You know, it's not that I lost this fight. Just before the knockout punch comes, I call a timeout and leave. You know, and so they can blame it on Ukraine. Well, they collapsed inside, you know, internal strife and turmoil. Zelensky, oh my God, you know, he made terrible decisions. Everybody made their bad decisions. We are out of here. And then they can go focus on imperialism in the Middle East, and they can pretend that they didn't lose a war that clearly they lost. I think you're right. And you're right. Donald Trump is perfect because he's not, as far as we see, he's not emotionally invested in Ukraine. He's not the guy that's the Biden people were like, we can't possibly lose. Well, guess what? It's more pronounced if they lose, because they said we can't lose. We mustn't lose. If we lose, that means the Russians won and everything's gone bad. And now they can bring in Donald Trump, a new guy who never liked this. I never wanted this. And whoever cared about this? You bring him in, he walks away, you blame it all on him. Well, if Trump hadn't walked away, Trump, the individual, hadn't walked away, we'd have surely won. We were this close to victory if it wasn't for that darn Trump. So you're right. They need a dynamic where they can exercise what I've been calling for years, the Samsonite option, where they pack their luggage and they leave. And it creates the dynamic. I've been saying, my thing was this: at some point, they're just going to walk away and leave this disastrous mess and say, Europeans, you guys want to do something with this or not, it's yours, and walk away. And so now Donald Trump is the man who has been designated to exercise the Samsonite option, I would say.
I think so. But we should also recognize that this has nothing to do with being anti-war. It's to do with wanting different wars. And when it comes to the wars, you are absolutely right. Donald Trump made it very clear in his last presidency and very clear in the intervening time, very clear during this presidential campaign, that he is absolutely servile to the Zionist imperialist machinery in the USA. He will be a promoter of the genocide, just as Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were. And this war, he understands, and his people, I don't really like to talk about he, but you know, the people who put him in power, he understands it's how he gets paid. He definitely understands that.
Well, can I put it a little different? Can I give you something a little different? Mm-hmm. Something a little bit different. Donald Trump has been saying, I want this thing to end before I come into office. I think rather than promote the continuance of a war, Israel's been battered mercilessly. They're in collapse. I think Donald Trump's job will be to clean up the mess to some extent, as the best as a ruling class. They've looked up like, we've lost these 2 wars. How do we lose wars? I think this is what they look. How do we lose wars without losing wars? Ukraine, Samsonite option. See ya, have a nice day, we're out. Boom, they're gone. Okay, that's an easy one. Leave that to the, and they can leave it to the Europeans. And if the Europeans try to do anything, it'll be a complete disaster. Then they blame it on the Europeans, right? Okay. They are looking at Israel, and the lights are flashing red. Oh my God, there are people in Israel saying, we've lost, we're screwed, we can't keep going. Donald Trump comes in and says, let's end this thing, right? But I think they have to have a plan for, yes, it's now obvious that kinetically, that physically, we can't use the cat's paw of Israel to impose our will in the Middle East. They have to have an alternative plan where they clean that mess up, and still, I think their plan is, how do we clean up this loss, kinetic physical loss? No matter what we do, how do we still maintain hegemony over the Middle East? So I don't think Donald Trump's job is to continue the war, either of the wars. I think now the job is, we've lost 2 wars. I'm like, you lost 2 wars. How do we not walk away without losing the war? Maintain the things we want and the hegemony we want in the region, knowing that physically we got the crap knocked out of us. Anyway, got about 5 more minutes. Your thoughts?
I think, it's really interesting what you say, Garland, and I don't have a crystal ball. It's very clear that the USA needs to retain, as you said, its hegemony over the Middle East. It needs those resources. It needs that domination. If it loses them, it's in an absolute tailspin. And the whole imperialist global economy is in a tailspin if British, French, and US imperialism are kicked out of the Middle East, which I think is what is in the process of happening. So yes, you're right. They're desperate to save that. That's why the unconditional support for Israel has been, as we've seen, so strong, despite the fact that it's been exposing the leaders of all the Western countries and the real motivations of the West in a way that nothing else has quite ever done in the eyes of their own and the peoples of the world. So the PR fallout from the unconditional support of the West for this public, socially, internet broadcasted genocide, real time footage on our phones genocide, has been horrific. It's fueling the political crisis at home for all the imperialist leaders. They need to maintain their hegemony. Zionism has been their favored tool. And, the Zionist regime is at the centerpiece of a very elaborate network of regimes to keep control of the whole region, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia and everything in between. There's a network of client regimes, Jordan, Emirates, all of that. And the problem is, if Israel falls, the likelihood is it all falls. And so they're in a kind of a weird quandary, aren't they? I can quite imagine that there will be some voices in there saying, Israel's not going to survive much longer. And how do we retain our hegemony without Israel? The problem is, I think that's a puzzle they can't solve.
Yeah, agreed.
They might try to. They might wrap it up various ways. But, the resistance, this movement that has bubbled up so fiercely now did not come out of nowhere. This is an expression of 100-year-long or more now, 105, 110-year battle of the Arab and Persian people for self-determination and liberation from foreign rule and imperialist exploitation. And this battle has been put on ice twice. It was put on ice after World War I. It was put on ice again after World War II. It's been manipulated, subverted, controlled, decimated. I mean, huge numbers of communists, everybody complains about how the people of the Middle East are all Islamists today. They all forget that most of their revolutionaries used to be secular. They were mostly murdered. Huge numbers of communists in the Middle East were murdered at the behest of imperialism to try to stop the advance of the national liberation struggles. And, all the wars that imperialism's fought since the fall of the Soviet Union have really, apart from Yugoslavia, been focused on the Middle East, on getting rid of any government that looked like in any way could protect its people and protect the sovereignty of its people or of the region. So this is a pivotal and most important war for the imperialists. 15 years ago, I think the CIA itself produced a report saying Israel's only going to last another 20 years. The clock is ticking on that. I personally, would be quite surprised if it makes it the next 5 years, given everything that's happening. I think this is a process, personally, that is not going to get interrupted. I don't think there's any way to implement a two-state solution. And I think that a one-state solution, with all of the ramifications of dismantlement of Israel, it would be very difficult for the imperialists to find some balance now where, okay, they let Israel go, but they preserve everything else. I think if they can find a way to that, they would. But I think they no longer have the power behind them. The days when people accepted American interference into these processes, yes, Americans come and negotiate our peace process for us. That was the world of the 1990s or the world of the 1950s and 60s. That's not the world we live in today. Right now, today, across the Middle East, every one of the liberation forces and the people on the street will tell you, yes, our enemy is Zionism, but Zionism is a front for imperialism. Behind Zionism stands the Americans and the British and the French. And I don't think there's a way back from that for the imperialists, really, particularly because we now have Russia and China rising in the world, able to help people who ask for their help. They don't come in where they're not wanted, but people do want them. They do want the economic and military help they can offer. And because of that, there's an added sense, not just of purpose, but of confidence to liberation forces, which we haven't seen in a very long time, really since the fall of the Soviet Union. Well,
we're going to have to run. We've got a lot more to say, because you can't really talk about the Middle East. There are two legs to that stool. And the two legs are Israel and all the comprador class in the Gulf states, right? And so they have to be concerned, because if they lose Israel, then they can't maintain the comprador class leaders in the Gulf states. And that's the direction things seem to be going. Joti Brar, where can everybody find you online?
Thank you, Garland. So if you look in Telegram and search my name, Joti Brar, you'll find I have a channel. And if you search for my party, The Communists is the name of our channel on Telegram. Our website is thecommunists.org.
With an S. Don't forget the S at the end.
Don't forget the S, or you'll get some weird Trotskyite website. And on YouTube.
Oh, YouTube. Yeah.
On YouTube, we have a channel called Proletarian TV, where you can get talks on all kinds of very important topics. And really, I just want to underline again that we're saying very, very much at the beginning of our talk, that my message to anybody who's interested, who's listening and thinks they like the things that they hear from me is, please, please, please go to our website, click on the link for study, and begin your own process of education by studying Marxism for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Don't rely on a guru to help you understand the world. Marxism is the tool for the masses to make sense of the world they're in, their place in it, to understand and come to a consciousness of themselves as the ruling class in waiting. The working class is the ruling class in waiting, but it needs to realize it is and act on that.
Thank you very much, Joti. Everyone, don't forget, there's a lot of shadow ban going on here. So make sure you click like, you subscribe, and most importantly, share this on all your social media platforms. Also, there's a great channel, Russian Accent, that transcribes a lot of this stuff and puts it in Russian. So if you have friends who speak Russian who may not be familiar with this, go to the Russian Accent channel, direct them there, and they can see the work that we're doing that, you know, on this channel. So thank you very much, Joti, and we are out. Oh, by the way, everyone else, we've got coming up next in about 20 minutes, I've got Mark Sloboda. He is in Moscow, and he's going to, we're going to talk about Donald Trump saying he's going to come in and he's going to end the war, and he's going to give he has a great plan that the Russians will be all over. I have a funny feeling that Joti and I were a lot closer to reality than the people who think that Donald Trump's going to fix this situation maybe. But we're going to hear from Mark and hear what the word is in Moscow, what they're thinking about this Trump victory. Thanks a lot, everybody. Don't forget, share this, particularly on X and everywhere else, because I ain't there. Have a nice day.